Hi everyone and welcome back to the Shack. If you've been a fan of the channel for a while, you'll know that we love a good Can You Build a Brand New series, and in the past we've built a new ZX Spectrum based on the Superfo Harlequin 128K kit, which is an amazing piece of work as it's 100% compatible with all software and hardware for the original Spectrum, despite not having the custom ULA chip. All of the logic that was present in that device is broken down to individual ICs, and it's an amazing achievement and a really fun build. We've also tackled this ZX80/81 build, which was a fun afternoon project as there's not really that much to those early Sinclair machines, but it works a treat, and although opinion is divided amongst you lovely folk, I think the 3D printed case looks suitably old school and futuristic at the same time. Over Christmas we made this Omega home computer, which is 100% compatible with MSX1 and MSX2 machines, again with a nice 3D printed case and a lovely retro paint scheme and retro keycaps. And this machine still has some stuff to add in, which will be coming in a future episode. Then there's the ZX Bearmulator project, which has stalled a little as I can't get hold of any Raspberry Pi 02s to test it. The global chip shortages are a bit of a nuisance, well, for modern chips anyway. But for this episode, we're mostly right back in the early 80s with a smattering of modern loveliness because we can. Yes, it's been a long time coming, but we're finally going to build ourselves a brand new Commodore 64 from nearly 100% new parts. Let's crack on. Here at the Shack, we'd like to give a huge thank you to the sponsor for this video, PCBWay. They help us out with all of our PCB fabrication needs and make fantastic boards at amazingly competitive prices. And it's not only PCBs that are on the menu. Apart from other fabrication services like CNC machining, 3D printing, sheet metal fabrication and injection moulding, PCBWay also have a great projects library of cool stuff to build from people all around the world. Oh, and if you don't like waving a soldering iron about, they can even assemble your PCBs for you. That's the PCB way. Right, on with the show. So I know that there are several remakes of C64 mainboards available on the market, such as this 60 clone board, which is available for around the £30 to £40 mark, and they're a very well respected version of the board, and by all accounts seem to be very reliable. But this board is already earmarked for a personal project, and besides, at the time I was looking to order one of these for the channel build, I couldn't get hold of one in black, which is what I wanted. And then of course I thought to myself, hang on, I wonder if there's anything on PCBWay's shared projects section, and lo and behold, there's this C64 mainboard replica by BWAC. And it's the 250407 1983 board as found in the original bread bin models, which is the one I wanted. So PCBWay worked their magic, and a few days later these beauties arrived in the post, and how gorgeous does this look? Good job PCBWay and BWAC of course. I think this is the only version of the PCB where the Gerber files are freely available, but please let me know in the comments if that's not the case. I already had a spare case and keyboard lying around in my spares bin from a dead C64, and I've been harvesting chips and bits off that board and testing them to keep as spares or to go towards a build such as this at some point. It's the one thing about these types of projects that I find quite dull, the ordering, harvesting and collecting of all the parts in the bill of materials in order to get started. That process took me months with the Omega home computer kit, and I was starting to think that to do this C64 build as inexpensively as possible probably just meant waiting out for cheap, broken C64s to come my way until I had all the parts. And then I came across the Retro 8-Bit Shop, who I must point out aren't sponsoring this video. In fact, they don't even know they're being mentioned until now, if they're even watching. But they sell a complete component kit for building a C64, including logic ICs, RAM, resistors, diodes, capacitors, connectors, in fact, everything you need apart from the custom Commodore chips, including all of the IC sockets and even the C64 fuse. And amazingly, all of this comes to €100 or 110 if you opt for the round pin sockets like we have here. And they also sell cases if you need one of those. I can't say how much time this has saved, and I wish this sort of service had been available for the Omega. This really is on a par with Byte Delight's Harlequin kit, albeit without the detailed assembly manual. For the custom chips, I've got a selection of original Commodore ICs and also this ARM SID. I do have an original 6581, but I wanted to test the latest firmware and do some comparisons, as last time I squared the ARM SID off against the later 8580 chip, and well, I'm curious. I've also got this replacement PLA chip based on 2 programmable GAL chips, and finally I've got this modern modulator replacement circuit which should help with providing crisp, clear video. Right, nice new and freshly tinned soldering tip, a whole day ahead of me, some stonking tunes from 1982 on in the background, and off we go. So the first thing to note here is that the silkscreen on this board is not quite as nicely presented as the 60 clone board, which is much more descriptive about which part goes where. You could simply sit down with the parts and pop them on without any need to refer to the BOM. And on that note, the pack supplied from the Retro 8-bit shop appears to be tailored to the 60 clone board, as they do link to that board on the product page for this parts kit, and also they stock the 60 clone labels and badges. The 60 clone boards are based on the Revision C board, and the one I'm populating is a copy of the Revision B, so there are a few things we have to consider as we go through the build, and I'll point them out along the way. As always, we want to start with the parts nearest the board, and invariably this means the resistors get the first taste of the solder, so let's open that pack first. Before placing any parts, it's always good to test if you can and make sure that what you've got in your hand is the same as listed in the BOM, just in case there were any errors when picking the order. This resistor reads 3.3 kilo ohms, matching the 3.3 kilo ohm description on the BOM, with colour bands orange, orange, red and gold. Looking at the resistor, the colour bands match, so we're all good. This might seem long-winded, but it's better to check up front rather than get a fizz bang later and have to backtrack through everything finding out where you went wrong. Right, let's get these resistors in, and as always, what we're looking for is nice, clean solder joints that are lovely and shiny, peaked, not beaded, and with enough solder to slightly bead through to the component side of the board. That looks just about perfect, so let's clip off the legs and get the rest soldered in. Slight typo on the BOM here on the 82 ohm resistor. The BOM says grey, black, red, gold, but it should be grey, red, black, gold. Whilst resistors don't have a polarity, these resistor packs do, and it's important to orient them correctly. The dot on the pack indicates which end holds pin 1, and pin 1 on the board is denoted by the square pad. Again, always worth double checking this. After an hour or so, we've got our resistors in place, including the 500 ohm variable resistor used to tune the output from the VIC chip to help get a nice display. So let's move on to the ceramic capacitors next, and you'll need your glasses for these if you're over 40, let me tell you. This 224 on the capacitor indicates that it's a 220 nanofarad capacitor, so let's put this and all of the other capacitors in place. As we place the capacitors, we can note one of the changes between the Rev B and C boards. This pack doesn't seem to have C205, which our board seems to want. My own Revision B board has the C203 marked on the board, but it isn't populated, and instead of C205, the factory board has this going on. C203 is sometimes populated on these boards to aid compatibility with some PLA chips, it seems, so our mileage may vary. Well, the board is starting to feel a little more populated now, so let's steam ahead with this next bag, which is the power rail and filters. And first out of here are these ferrite beads, which are all over these boards in an effort to keep energy noise to a minimum. And there are 22 of these provided, so let's get them in. And with those in place, it's time for a cuppa and a biscuit. Feeling refreshed after that, and it didn't take long to pop in the rest of the components that comprise the power circuit. And we've just got the choke to pop in later. It's a tall part, so we'll do that when we do the larger capacitors and connectors. We've repurposed a salvaged crystal, as the one in the pack was a later style package, and well, this one just looks nicer and more in keeping with the board, I think. And so it's on to that part that I love, soldering the sockets. Cue the music. Well, that's all of the logic and RAM sockets in place. Now time to move on to the larger sockets. With the larger sockets fitted, we'll pop that choke on next, and then we only have the larger electrolytic capacitors and the connectors to go. Connectors first, I think, starting with the cartridge port. Halfway through that, it was time for a nice new soldering tip. In goes the power connector, followed by the video out socket. Next up is the serial socket and the power socket. And here we hit another snag. The joystick ports supplied don't fit this Rev B board, so it's to the parts bin for these older ones, which secure to the board with screws rather than relying on a solder connection. Arguably a better choice, but I imagine the removal of the screws was a cost-saving exercise. Anywho, these get fitted next. And they fit a treat. Right, what's next? Well, pop the fuse in before I forget and wonder why things aren't working later. And remember, when fitting these fuse holders, that they are directional and have a little barrier to stop the fuse sliding out of one side, so important to solder them in the correct way round. That's in, and yes, I know it's not perfectly straight. I'm calling that quirky because it's the best I can get it. Not the fault of the board, a combination of a slightly misshaped part and my ineptitude. Moving on. Last components to be soldered are the electrolytic capacitors. Remember that these have a polarity and the positive lead is the longer one. And here's the populated board. I had to replace R31 as it's a 180 ohm resistor on the revision C boards, but it's 1K on this board. C204 is left empty on this board, and C203 can be left empty too. Some of the capacitors are ceramic caps on the Rev C, but are electrolytic on the Rev B, such as C12 here. Here's that lovely old crystal I mentioned earlier. C70 is also different between the revisions, and the joystick ports, of course. You'll have noted that there's no modulator in here, and that's because I don't need RF output, so we'll be using this modern modulator replacement by Copper Dragon. It has options for both a long board like we have here, and also for the short board that was fitted to the 64C. And that looks really nice, and was the main reason I wanted a black PCB in the first place, to match with this, and I'm glad I did. And it was at this point that something caught my eye. We have a dead pin on one of the sockets. The inner sleeve of the round pin is missing, so let's quickly replace that. Perfect. Now, before we put any chips in here, we should test out the power rail to make sure that the voltage regulators are outputting the correct voltages. Remember that these long boards have both a 5 volt and a 12 volt rail, so we don't want to be putting 12 volts through anything that isn't expecting it. So a quick poke around the board with a multimeter and all looks good. Let's pop those chips in. So with all of those chips in place, let's cross our fingers and power on the machine for the first time. Well, nothing. Nada. Disappointing. But wait, could this be simple stupidity? Well, yes it could. I made exactly the same mistake that Yambita did when he fitted one of these modulator replacements to a long board machine, not connecting up the ground. Oh, anyway, I should also have shorted this pad to identify that we're using a VIC2 chip, as that uses both 12 volt and 5 volt. So anyway, that's corrected. Let's give it another go. Well, that's better. We have a blue screen and we have a border. Well, that means at least the CPU is working. A blank screen like this is usually a bad basic ROM, the 901226, the one on the left. The one on the right shouldn't be there, but we'll discover that in a moment. And with the new basic ROM installed, let's power up and, well, that looks like a Commodore 64 boot screen, albeit with garbled characters. Now at this point I still hadn't discovered that second 901226 sitting where a 901225 should be, and I was firmly believing that this was a problem with one of the CIA chips. So I removed both of those and made sure they were making good contact and that there were no shorts, and nothing seemed to work. I had the dead test cartridge and harness all plugged in, but nothing on screen was readable. It was only when I took this photo that I noted the wrong chip. What a donut. I replaced the 901226 with the correct 901225, and when I flicked the power switch for what seemed like the 800th time, voila! The diagnostic cartridge reports a clean bill of health across the chip, so I'm keen to plug in the keyboard and see this machine come to life. And if that don't make me a happy boy, I'm not sure what would. My very own Commodore 64 built from nearly 100% new parts. Popping in the Kung Fu Flash and a joystick, and it's clear that everything is working fine. It's been a fun build, and apart from the slight differences between the revisions, a relatively simple one too. In the end, it was silly mistakes that prevented the board working straight away. Anyway, I'm off to enjoy this machine now and muse over whether I want to go the whole hog and get a new case on the go also. I guess that's the next episode. Right, that's it for today, and as always we hope you've enjoyed the episode. If you like the channel, please subscribe and hit the bell for notifications of new content. Please leave your comments below, as we always love to read them. And if you've got anything you'd like to donate and see featured on the channel, please drop us an email. If you'd like to support us, there are links for Patreon and our Buy Us a Coffee page in the banner on the main channel page. So, until next time in the Retro Shack, I'm going to spend me some time with my new home-built C64. Goodbye from me, and see you next time in the shack.